So, hello again. Hi. Tonight is our second Meet the Press seminar with foreign correspondents. Thank you again for coming this evening. Martin Fackler, who is the bureau chief of the New York Times, was supposed to join us this evening, but he suddenly got called away for an assignment. So instead, I have someone who I am really, really happy to introduce, Jonathan Soble, who is also with the New York Times. Please give him a warm welcome. Okay, now I'm going to do my introduction. I haven't checked with you on this, so I hope it's okay.
Okay, I'll correct you if it's wrong, but I'm sure it's fine.
All right. Jonathan joined the New York Times in October 2014. Before that, he spent 7 years at the Financial Times. For 2 of those years, he was the FT's Tokyo bureau chief. He won an award for his coverage of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accident. And as probably many of you know, he won an award for his coverage of the Olympus accounting scandal. Jonathan broke the story worldwide after a clandestine meeting with the former CEO and whistleblower, Michael Woodford. I remember that. That was really exciting. Jonathan was born in Canada. He has a bachelor's degree in international relations and Japanese from the University of Toronto and a master's degree from Columbia's University Graduate School of Journalism. But I also wanted to point out that he has very generously served on the FCCJ Board of Directors for several years. I don't know, how many years was it?
3.
3, yeah. And was treasurer for all of those. I was one of the lucky ones to work with him. If any of you have been on the board or on a committee, and if you haven't been on a committee yet, please join. You know how much time that involves. So we've been very, very grateful for all that he's done for the club. Just a couple of more things. He often appears on Japanese TV programs to comment on news topics in his fluent Japanese. He is also a formidable yoga practitioner. So these muscles here, they're from yoga. They're not from lifting weights. And he is also, get this, an awesome DJ who performs regularly at clubs throughout Tokyo. He's awesome.
You're talking about someone else.
Maybe later you can tell some of us where you're going to perform next. Sure. Okay, so you're on. Would you like to start?
Thank you. All of that is correct, except I actually had to stop yoga with some back problems last year, so
really?
now I'm mostly swimming.
Oh, but okay. Oh, just as good.
Thank you. Good evening. Good evening. Thanks for inviting me. The title of tonight's talk is Martin's, and I'm pinch hitting for Martin, and I hope you won't be disappointed that you won't be hearing from him. But my understanding is that this really is Meet the Press in the sense that I can tell you a bit about myself, I can tell you a bit about how the New York Times works, and then we can throw it open, and you can ask me whatever you like, and we can discuss any kind of topic that you like. My background was pretty well covered by Lucy. I'm Canadian, as she said. I'm 41 years old. I've spent most of my adult life in Japan and a small part of my pre-adult life. I first came here literally by the luck of the draw. I was thinking it was actually 30 years ago this year. I was 11 years old, and I got involved with a group called Children's International Summer Villages. It's a group, I think it's based in the UK, and they hold what are essentially summer camps around the world every year. They take kids from a dozen different countries and throw them together, and they have them live together for a month in the hopes that they will grow up to be global, peaceful, non-racist citizens one day. And I got involved in this mainly because my parents were school teachers, so they were plugged into all these kind of activities you could do. And the year that I did it, the chapter of this organization in my hometown in Canada was sending kids to 3 places. One of them was Japan, one of them was San Francisco, one of them was the Faroe Islands in Denmark. And where you went depended on, they pulled your name out of a hat. So, it was Billy, you are going to Denmark. Jane, you are going to San Francisco. And it was Jonathan, you are going to Japan, which I thought was cool, but I didn't know anything about Japan. So I spent a month here. We used, it was a high school in Kanagawa Prefecture somewhere, turned it into a dormitory. We hung out, played in the pool, took little excursions, went to Mount Fuji, went to Asakusa, had a photo op with the Prime Minister Nakasone. Yeah, yeah. It was also my first encounter with the Japanese press. My grandmother became a huge fan of Japan and of its media and diplomatic institutions, because when she heard that I had met the Prime Minister, she immediately called up the Japanese, either the embassy or the consulate in Toronto, and said, "My grandson met your Prime Minister, and I want a photograph. I'm sure there were photographers there, and I want a photograph." And sure enough, within a week, a photograph arrived, a couple of big glossy photographs of our photo op, and apparently the embassy had called the press club to see who was on duty shooting these kids that day. They got in touch with the newspaper, got photographs, sent it back. I mean, it was all very quick, and she was stunned and impressed by Japanese thoughtfulness and efficiency that they would actually respond to this request. So I had family endorsement for coming back to Japan very early on. And I did come back. I thought Japan was a cool place and a fun place, and the people were nice. And so in high school, I came back on a Rotary Club student exchange deal. I was in Kanazawa in Ishikawa Prefecture for a year. Also a good experience, started to learn the language. Also realized that the young people having really the most fun in Japan were the university students, so I resolved to come back in university. I did that. I spent a year at Kansei Gakuin University near Kobe. Came back again on the JET program, which some of you may be familiar with. That was in Kochi Prefecture and Shikoku. So I really had a tour around Japan before finally coming back to Tokyo in 2002 to be a journalist. And my resume was somewhat covered. I actually started at Dow Jones on the news wires, writing about the foreign exchange market and all kinds of stuff that I knew next to nothing about. I went to Reuters and then joined the Financial Times in 2007, worked there until last year, and now I'm at the New York Times. So that's me in a nutshell. Now, what about the New York Times? Now, you know there's Martin, who was supposed to be here, and there's me, and that's it. We're a two-person operation here in Tokyo. We have 2 support staff, very knowledgeable bilingual people who help us make calls and do research and so on and so forth. But we're a 4-person office with two staff journalists. The way it works essentially is that Martin, who is the bureau chief, writes about the politics, and I write about the economics. So that's pretty much how we work. I'm not sure what else you want me to talk about. Would you like me to talk? I mean, in terms of the stories I've been involved in, I mean, the Olympus scandal was probably the one that I was most centrally involved in and am best known for. But that was 4 years ago, and you've probably already heard everybody yarn about Olympus, including myself, including Michael Woodford, the British CEO who got fired, who's been back a few times. So I don't really want to regale you with old Olympus war stories. Although if you have any questions about it, I'm more than happy to answer them. I suspect many of you will want to know about our reporting here and how our relations with the government, but maybe I'll leave that to specific questions if you want to know anything about that. I'm going to turn it over, and if we run out of questions, I can start yarning again halfway through. But that's it for me.
All right, great. All right, so let's open up the floor to questions. You can ask anything. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yes? Yeah, please. Yeah. Thanks. Do we have a mic? Oh, why don't you go ahead and use this one?
I'm Makoto Honjo Associate. Regarding...
You have to turn it on, I think.
It's on. Regarding Mike Woodford, the common sort of wisdom in Japan is that he got paid off and he made it rich, and basically he sort of became quiet. What is your take about all of that, subsequent things that happened to Mike Woodford?
Okay, good question. Well, he did get paid off. He won a wrongful dismissal lawsuit against Olympus. He has never disclosed officially how much it was, but I reported at the time, and I still think it was true, that it was in the neighborhood of £10 million, because he had more than 4 years left on his contract, so it was the remaining money that he would have been paid, plus some damages. So, yeah, he has lots of money, and he has spent that subsequent time largely on the lecture circuit. He goes to corporate governance events and so on and tells his story. Knowing him, I don't think that he just took the money and ran. I mean, if you remember, after his revelations were finally confirmed and admitted by the company, he came back to Japan and he made an attempt to come back to Olympus. He was organizing a kind of a coup d'etat, friendly, against the Olympus management by trying to get some of the outside investors in Olympus, primarily foreign investment funds, to back him as CEO in a kind of, he was going to he tried to put together an alternative slate of directors, including himself, that would challenge the only slightly shaken up Olympus management a few months after all this happened. In the end, it didn't work. He didn't have the votes. There wasn't enough investor support to make him and his slate of directors put them back in charge of the company. And when that failed, I think he thought, well, there's really nothing much more I can do at or for Olympus. If he really was only interested in taking the money and run, he didn't have to do that. I mean, he was, in fact, had that succeeded, and he worked very hard to try and make it succeed, he would have been worse off financially, because he wouldn't have been able to sue the company for wrongful dismissal. He wouldn't have been able to collect the outstanding balance on his contract and go do whatever he wanted. So I think that's evidence that his heart was in the right place. But at a certain point, it just didn't work. And I think in the end, he did become somewhat bitter and disillusioned about the possibility of making radical change in Japan and at Japanese companies and institutions. So that's my take on Woodford since then. Yeah.
Anybody else? Yes, please. Gentleman here. Yes. You're going to have to come up and grab this from me. Or you can, if you want to go over here.
Anton Millington, European Automobile Manufacturers Association. Western journalists writing about Japan are sometimes accused of trivializing the country. I mean, particularly those who perhaps are new arrivals, and I know this doesn't apply in your case, that perhaps because of the nature of the job, maybe because of the pressure from their editorial staff back at home base, they have to go through the rite of passage of writing stories about anime, lift girls, and all the other sort of cliched Western stereotypes about Japan. Do you think that that is a fair criticism? I mean, not of your own paper, but of Western journalists as a whole. But then going on from there, I wonder whether you could perhaps describe for us and explain the process by which the stories that you and your colleagues or colleague at the New York Times get to cover in Japan. I mean, to what extent are you initiating the stories from Tokyo, or do your editors back at base have certain preconceptions that they wish to have reinforced and justified by the reports that are made from their correspondents in Tokyo?
Thank you. I think it is a fair criticism. I think a disproportionate amount of the news out of Japan is in the latest weird cat cafe, eyeball licking, a new trend among Japanese middle school kids category. That was a real thing. I mean, it was a real story. It wasn't actually real, but I think part of that is that, I mean, Japan does provide maybe a disproportionate share of weird and wacky material, and whether you choose to actually make all of your reports about that is a separate thing. Also, I think once you get a reputation for that, then the preconceived storyline is always the most tempting one. I mean, Japan, partly because of what actually is here, partly just, and partly not through no fault of its own, has gotten this reputation as as an endlessly fruitful source of weird and wacky news. And once that happens, and I think that the demand is there, and the demand for kind of trivial news generally, whether it's celebrity news or whatever, is fairly large in the world. And the part of that Japan fills, since not too many people know Japanese celebrities, is the sort of slightly bizarre, weird, and wacky. And the internet has probably magnified that because editors are also defensive. So when newspaper A or what has something weird, then you get calls. We don't get calls, but I think in a general, we as in the media, a lot of people get calls. Oh, did you see the latest thing on that whatever it is? So it's that kind of responsive, they have it, so we should have it kind of mentality also kicks in. As far as the Times is concerned, I mean, I've been lucky enough, I suppose, to work for news organizations that aren't particularly interested in that sort of stuff. That said, though, I mean, I don't necessarily think only serious and somber news is the only way to go. I think there's a place for unusual stuff, and one day I want to write like the best weird and wacky Japan story. I mean, I think there's one day I want to write something that really goes in depth and actually finds out what is really up with phenomenon X. And these stories could be done in a very interesting way because we've all heard of these things, and they could be, they can be sort of brushed off in 500 words between lunch and dessert, or maybe there's space for a really good story about something wacky in Japan. Generally speaking, though, there's not a whole lot of demand. Speaking 6 months at the New York Times and 7 years at the FT, there wasn't a whole lot of demand for that. So more broadly, I would say a lot of the news we cover is obviously important. So there doesn't necessarily have to be, I don't have to push my editors. They don't have to drag me. It's just something happens, and this is obviously a New York Times story. So we sort of come to a mutual agreement. Sometimes I have to pitch something. Occasionally, my editors have to drag me, kicking and streaming into a story if I felt like I've written this one 100 times. But there's a back and forth kind of mutual process. I'd say that the stuff that I generate, my own ideas that my editors are hearing of for the first time, is more like feature stories. But your day-to-day news stories are generally sort of out there happening, and you just jump on them. Whoever picks up the phone first. It's not really a question of someone pushing the other person to do it. I think that the New York Times has a very strong preference for clear narratives, is the one thing I will say. Just getting back to kind of, you talked about preconceptions. The real driver is narratives, clarity. And the reality is that the world is sometimes messy. And to fit a story into a clear narrative, you sometimes have to resist. You sometimes feel yourself being pulled away from nuance. And so the trick is, how do you keep that in there while making a story sharp? And I think that's the biggest challenge. More than any, Japan is X or Japan is Y. It's more about, when I read this story, I want to know what you think Japan is, what this story says Japan is. And that's not reality doesn't conform to that often. So that's the trick as far as I'm concerned.
All right, yeah, good question, good answer. Yes, please, go ahead, yes.
Greetings. Good to see you. Welcome to our club. I'm one of the oldest members of the club, as you can see. And I think Emerson Chapin was very active when I was very active here at the club around 1967 or so. Through the years, I followed the New York Times, David Sanger's appearance here, Abe Rosenthal before then. I knew most of them, except in recent years. I haven't tried to keep in touch. But the thing that impresses me is what the New York Times doesn't write. Why don't they write a series of articles on Okinawa that explains to the world, or at least the New York world, I came from New York, and that's why I read, it's my home paper, that since 1945, Okinawa is in the longest period of peace and prosperity in its history. Why? Why doesn't anyone try to answer that question? Thank you.
Doesn't that apply to Japan in general?
It does.
So I'm not sure that there's an obvious need for a story that says that specifically about Okinawa. I think when we're covering Okinawa and covering controversies about American bases, it's...
It's like the police department in New York,
In what way?
controversies.
Well, yeah, but no war today is not a story anywhere.
Rate of crime in all of Japan. Did you know that?
Okinawa has the highest rate of crime in all of Japan.
By each prefecture.
Okay. It's also the poorest prefecture in Japan, isn't it?
Could be, I'm not sure if it's actually. They don't seem to be. They seem to be richer. I took a trip a few years ago and took the bus from Naha to Nago, and I saw great prosperity compared to what I saw several years before. We stopped at Ginowan, where the base is, and we were there for about a half hour, and I said, "Where's the noise?" And the bus driver laughed. There isn't much.
Well, I think there's always room for more...
Have you done that? Have you looked? It looks like it's all somewhat biased reporting, I must say. Not on New York.
Okay.
Or anything, but somebody's biased.
Well, what kind of stories are you covering these days?
Well, I'm writing about economics and business mostly. So I'm writing about, Abenomics. Is it working? Is it not working? I'm doing a little corporate stuff. So it's actually a little bit about what I used to do at the FT, but now for the New York Times audience. So I haven't been to Okinawa as a New York Times reporter.
What about the greatest period of peace in Okinawa's history or Japan's history since 1945? No in-depth pieces on why?
Well, I think we have
You
written...
need to know that because they're getting all this stuff about right-wing Abe with no balance.
Okay.
Well, there you go.
Thank you.
Your next pitch. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. So anybody else? Yes, Ambassador, please. Yes?
Yeah. Thank you very much. It's interesting. Writer, a New York Times and Financial Times, economist. My question related to question of inequality. As you know, Thomas Piketty looked at the last 1,000 years of economics, inequality, and his conclusion was that after World War I and World War II, the West changed, become more middle-class society and developed. But recently, we are seeing more crises of inequality. What the worry is that we are going to get more instability, more insecurity. My question to you is, where are we going through this advanced economics with the issue of inequality?
Inequality. Oh. Are you referring to Japan, which is what I write about, or generally? Okay. Well, I think that if you look at many measures, Japan is becoming less equal than it used to be. I mean, the Gini coefficient, poverty rates, both adult and child poverty rates, not dramatic swings, but general, and long-term shifts towards inequality. I don't think Japan was ever the homogeneously middle-class society that Japan's sort of self-identity made it out to be, but it's becoming even less so. And I think a lot of other countries are going to follow in the sense that when Japan started to go through economic crisis, 20 years ago. A lot of the structures, that were in place were based on this, an idea of ever increasing prosperity. And when the high growth era ended, they became increasingly untenable. But a lot of the structures are still in place, and they're strained. I mean, that's why you see, for example, 40% of the workforce now in part-time and temporary jobs. It used to be much lower. I mean, we have an economy that is designed still in many ways for kind of lifetime employment and a kind of company takes care of you system that is straining under that, and Japan hasn't yet been able to make all the adjustments. So you're getting kind of increases in inequality at the margins. Now, I think in a way, Japan, the rest of the world and Japan are now facing, in a similar part of the, economic cycles. I mean, you start to hear a lot of talk now about structural stagnation in Europe, for example, less in the United States, and I think a lot of the rest of the world has kind of becoming Japanified. So these aren't necessarily unique Japanese problems, but Japan has its own legacies from the era of high growth that it hasn't yet been able to deal with. I don't see that changing. I mean, I certainly don't think the government's main priority is to try and fix equality. Its main priority is to try and kickstart growth. And if it works, then maybe everybody gets a bit richer, but they don't get equally richer. So I think that's where we're at right now.
Does that answer your question? Is that okay? Okay, great, thanks. Okay, any more questions? Anybody? Yes? Go ahead, Peter. Go ahead. Yes, please. And then Nazafarin.
Thank you. You've had the vantage point of working for Dow Jones, FT, and now the New York Times. And as a reader, they strike me as, at least on the editorial pages, as having quite different perspectives, ranging from full-throated defense of the free market to a more mixed model with the FT in the middle to a more distant, sometimes more skeptical view of business at the New York Times. And I'm curious to see how you think about framing the story at the New York Times. And do you feel that you consciously frame them differently from the way you did at FT? Thank you.
I do. It has less to do with politics and more to do with the nature of the readership. New York Times readers are smart and well-educated, but they're not necessarily specialists to the degree that the typical FT reader is. You can take FT stories are shorter, for one thing, but you can also take a lot more specialist knowledge for granted, and as well as specialist interest. So I find that my stories are framed more to try and capture a general reader, my stories now need to explain technical terms or avoid them, and my stories now need to be a little more human. At the FT, if you could get a sort of real human being in your story about the Bank of Japan's monetary policy, that was great, but it was kind of a bonus. You didn't necessarily need to be in there. At the New York Times, and ultimately, unless it's about people, well, it's not going to fly. So I think the major change for me has been in structuring the story for a certain kind of audience. I have not felt any kind of internal sort of political pressure. No, we don't believe this about capitalism, or we don't believe this about Japan. Make it like that. It's not like that at all. So, and going back to, for example, Dow Jones, which, if you're talking about the editorial page, has the most pointedly right-wing editorial page around. They do a pretty good job of separating the daily news. And the fact is that it was the beginning of my career, and I was writing about today's moves in the foreign exchange options market and pointing ahead to things like that. So there wasn't a whole lot of broad analysis of the, where you would even have reason to have it framed in a certain way based on the organization's politics. And as far as I left before I ever rose high enough that would have mattered. So I can't really speak from experience at Dow Jones, but from the people I know, I do think they do a pretty good job of separating the news gathering business from the editorial page.
Okay, yeah, Nazafarin, どうぞ.
Hello, my name is it working? I'm Naza Farin. I'm working for NHK World. With all the explanations Lucy said about you, maybe I should ask if you are married, or if not, which club do you go? But I think that people don't like it. So I would like to know about the news you covered about nuclear, Fukushima, nuclear accident, and I want to know more about how you made this news, and about the also if you had any problem with the government after you worked on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I am married. I still go to clubs, but I am married. Yes. What's that? Yes, I'm at one now. That's right. Swinging one. As for Fukushima, yeah, when the earthquake and tsunami happened, at the time the FT had 4 reporters in Tokyo, and we immediately split up into 2 groups, basically based on where we happened to be that day and who could get where. And the bureau chief at the time, Muir Dickey, some of you may know him, and another colleague of mine, Lindsay Whipp, immediately jumped in a car and headed north. So they became the tsunami disaster zone team. And then another colleague who has since left the paper, Michio Nakamoto, and myself stayed in Tokyo, and we became essentially the nuclear disaster team, because you couldn't go to the reactors. You kind of had to rely on reporting here. So my main focus, in the very immediate aftermath, we all wrote about the tsunami. But as soon as it became clear that the nuclear story was building, then the focus of the 2 of us in Tokyo was Fukushima. I remember watching NHK the day, it was the 3rd day of the crisis, the Sunday, when the first of the reactor buildings blew up. Was it the Sunday or the Saturday? I can't remember at this point. But I remember, basically I had NHK on full time because they carried all the press conferences live. They were the fastest with a lot of the news. And I remember the NHK announcers saying, we have reports that there may have been a sound of some kind, at the reactor. We're not sure what it was exactly. And then a few moments later, we have some still pictures, and they sort of held up a still picture, of what looked like maybe some smoke coming out of one of the buildings. And I remember thinking, this is very strange, because throughout the crisis, they had kept coming back to a shot of the nuclear station taken from out to sea from a boat, with a zoom lens. So they had a camera trained on this place constantly, and yet suddenly we're getting these weirdly hesitant, some still pictures. And I also remember that the physicist that they had on also quite regularly as the commentator, who was a Tokyo University nuclear physicist, sort of said, well, if there was some sort of explosion, it may have been on purpose. They may have set it off as part of the, to sort of drain off some hydrogen. It may be how they're trying to take care of the crisis. Oh, fine. And it just, this went on for about 15 minutes. This is so strange. And I hadn't really been watching the Minpo, the private TV channels. And so it finally occurred to me, I can change the channel. So I flipped over to whatever the closest one to the dial is to NHK. And sure enough, they're showing this thing blowing up, on a loop, like, and so I was like, wow, this is really a very different way of covering. So that's my main memory of how NHK covered it, and then I remember the professor's when NHK finally showed a video clip of the explosion that the professor. I've never seen a man's face fall on live TV quite like that. I didn't see him much on NHK after that. But in terms, I mean, a difference that I remember too is that, you know, a couple of days in, Yukio Edano, the chief cabinet secretary at the time, who was the main and also constantly on TV as a problem, said quite clearly that you know, that there was a possibility that there had been a meltdown. And I had a reason to look at this the other day because I was rehashing the whole thing with somebody who was saying, well, you know, the government denied that there was a meltdown. But sure enough, I looked back over my story from about the third day of the crisis, and the first quote in about the third paragraph is Edano saying, "Oh, yeah, there's a chance, or we can't deny that there's a possibility." I mean, it was slightly hedged, but they didn't know for sure there was a meltdown. And then very quickly, you know, that became sort of the taboo line, and everyone kind of fell in line with that. And so that 6 months later or so, when the government released a report saying, oh, there had been a meltdown, there was this kind of, we are shocked that they would announce a meltdown now. You know, they covered up at the time. This is a strange sort of experience of the media, you know, which is relevant a little bit today to this whole idea of, is there pressure on the media or is the media self-censoring, right? And to me, that seemed like a pretty obvious example of self-censoring because the man said it. And then suddenly, after, you know, the media stopped reporting it and pretended that he never said it, and then pretended to be surprised and shocked and angry 6 months later when the government started using the word again. So I'm not sure who's at fault there. But we said it, and we kept saying it. As for anyone getting angry, no, not really. Frankly, I think the government had a lot on its plate and was... And there was a lot of irresponsible reporting in the foreign media. I mean, if NHK was at the extreme of, you know, having a mandate where everybody was supposed to just remain calm and it's being taken care of, you know, I would flip from NHK to CNN, and I would think I was watching two different disasters happening on different planets. And I'm not sure, you know, I mean, my other memory of TV coverage of that was. Was it Greta Van Susteren? One of the CNN anchors having a live on-air argument with the CNN chief weatherman, the meteorologist, about whether or not a deadly radioactive cloud was coming towards, you know, California and was going to kill Americans. I mean, she was insisting live on air that was happening. And this poor guy was saying, well, you know, it doesn't really work that way. She's no, we should all freak out, basically. So I'm not, you know, I certainly don't want to give the impression that I think that the failings of coverage were all on the Japanese media side. I think there were failings everywhere, just maybe different kinds of failings. And I'd like to think that, I mean, I'm sure our coverage wasn't perfect. There wasn't a lot of information to base it on it a lot of the time. But I'd like to think that we kept to a moderate middle, and I've never had any serious problems with the government or even with TEPCO. I mean, yeah, I think they were so beaten down that they really didn't have much to fight back with at that point. Yeah.
Okay, yes, please, go ahead, yes.
Right, thank you for your talk. I have a question about two things that you have mentioned. One is the Fukushima that you have just talked about, and another is a point that you made at the beginning about how the internet magnifies news or stories. And I work from a science background, and I work with a lot of science journalists and science researchers in Japan. And what we saw in Fukushima was that traditionally people will get their information from the news, and the news is written for them. It's written so it can give them a perspective of what's happening around them. But as you say, with the spread of the internet, suddenly people have access to information that isn't written for them, but it's about topics that they're concerned about. So the researchers that I have worked with have been analyzing data and public perception after the Fukushima disaster, and they continually find that a lot of people were using the internet to find information from sources like CNN, and they were constantly bombarded by reports like the CNN reporter you were saying that people overseas should be freaking out about these radiation clouds. So people in Japan were thinking, so we're going, what does that mean for me? Does this mean, obviously this means the Japanese media is lying to us. And so my question to you is, if such a disaster were to happen, say tomorrow, would you be writing your stories for an audience in New York, or would you try to be aware that your stories are being read by a more global audience? Would you try to pitch it in a way that it's written for a global audience?
Well, since I joined the Times, and so we'll start kind of far away from science a little bit, but since I've joined the Times, I have submitted a couple of stories that had introductions that were kind of referenced America. It's like, because it's an American newspaper. I mean, I'm Canadian. I have no necessarily need to do that, but I thought, well, this is an American newspaper, and I should sort of make it relevant to an American audience. And those things have inevitably been cut. And I've been told, we're not really, we're trying to be sort of global. This is not all about America. So I don't think it would be a case where we're writing specifically for America. We are very aware that our audience is global. At the same time, am I going to write something because Japanese people might read it and it's their backyard, et cetera, et cetera? No. I mean, I'm a foreign correspondent talking about Japan for the world. America first, sure, because it's an American newspaper, but the world. So that's the short answer in terms of who we're looking at in terms of audience. I agree with you that after March 11th, 2011, a lot of people in Japan started to. I mean, that's when Twitter took off in Japan. Really, a lot of people started looking for non-traditional sources of news in a way that they hadn't before, and I think that was partly because they felt like they were getting the full story from their own media, which was true to a degree. Unfortunately, some of those sources were at the other extreme. So there's good and bad, but I think if another disaster happened tomorrow, I think a lot of people would be much more quickly and enthusiastically plugged into the internet to try and diversify their news sources, which on the whole I don't think is a bad thing. The danger, of course, is that it can be difficult to differentiate between sources of news when it all comes piling through in an internet feed. Was there more? I mean, is there anything? I'm not sure what else I can answer with a non-science background myself. I mean, that is definitely. I mean, I definitely saw that happen. But our job is to try and is certainly not to think about what if this gets picked. I mean, we're trying to be responsible. Period. So, I mean, ideally, I'm writing a story that if a Japanese person reads it in translation through somebody's Twitter link, they would be getting correct information because that's the kind of information I'm trying to provide, period. So I don't actually think it makes that much difference. That's basically how we think of as our audience. Yeah.
So global audience.
Yeah, and we had the advantage too, of having science reporters. I mean, a lot of our stories, the news would be written. This is going back to the Financial Times, but the news stories would be written out of Japan. But we had a science reporter in London, a very smart guy, Clive Cookson, who would then, be doing reporting on some of the technical topics that you didn't actually have to be in Japan to be doing. So we had graphics and explainer stories about how. The reactors work and how radiation works and should we really be, what the dangers really are. So I think we did provide a lot of balance, to be honest. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, please go ahead. Yep.
Hi, my name is Ted Kano. I'm with Wacom, the company in Tokyo, a Japanese company with global operation. And we'd like to ask a few questions about from the perspective PR stuff in Japanese company. I'm with Wacom for 2 years and several months, and struggling very hard to get the PR operation up and running. And for those who do not know Wacom so well, Wacom is a company who sells tablet devices that will be hooked up to a computer to write graphics and design. And the company is very small, but it's a niche champion type of company because in the graphic tablet, Wacom is the leader with 80% market share. But business is so small, the market is so small, so Wacom is not well known in the world. So what I'm trying to do is that how we can be featured in various media. But what we do, what I'm doing, oftentimes go, unnoticed because Wacom is so small. So I'm wondering that if you guys, like a Tokyo Correspondent, you're obviously short-handed with 2 months operation, etc. But there are numerous companies in Japan. Major companies, global companies, maybe you get your hand full with reporting those kinds of guys. But if you're interested in tapping into unnoticed company like Wacom, definitely I would like to tell you that I'm here. And my question to you regarding that is that how do you try to identify the story you'd like to feature in your media from Japan, or how do you find out what you'd like to report? Maybe that will give me a hint.
Well, it is, the Nikkei Shimbun has a reporter for every company. We have one reporter for the whole economy, so it is difficult to get to everybody. And but I have an easy answer to that question on the general level, which is how do we give us news? When I was at the FT and doing more corporate reporting, I had a stock pitch that I would use to every PR person that I met, and that was basically what it boiled down to. We would be asked, we made this, and we would often be told, we made this announcement about an important new product or an acquisition last week, and we had our press conference, and this is and you weren't there, and I noticed that the FT didn't write about it, and why is that? It's very perplexing. And I would say, well, yeah, it was interesting. In fact, I knew about it in advance because it was in the Nikkei. It was in the Nikkei 2 days before. And they say, well, yeah, but we sometimes have to give them stories, or sometimes they get stories, but what does that matter? I was like, well, it's already out there. But that's Japanese. Only Japanese people read the Nikkei. And this goes back to your question. Well, actually, because it works in the other way. It's like, well, actually, not only Japanese people read the Nikkei. Every morning it gets translated, and the wire services pick it up, and it goes around the world. And, the kind of core audience who cares about mergers in the whatever power shovel sector, whoever I'm talking to, they knew about it. So it kind of diminishes the news value for us. Oh, really? You don't get as excited about a story when it's already been reported by someone else. Yes, that's true. And these were very mysterious. Oh, it's very mysterious. Yeah. So, I had this pitch. I'm like, if you want to get, and with apologies to my Nikkei colleagues, I was like, if you want to get, foreign media interested in stories, make sure that they get it fresh. Even if you can't give it to them exclusively. I'm like, oh, exclusively? Well, what? Would you like to have your stories exclusively? Of course I would, yes. They seem very surprised that we work on the same principle as media in Japan, which is that, a scoop is good. And if you can't get a scoop, the next best thing is to have the story at the same time as, no later than anyone else. This was mystifying. And so I would inevitably come away to these meetings with a promise, okay, next time, well, maybe we can't guarantee a scoop, but we'll make sure that you get it first among everyone else at least. Okay. And then a month later, sure enough, I opened up the Nikkei, and this company's next big deal is in there. So the message never really seeped through. But that was my pitch, and it was an honest pitch, because that's how we work. I mean, if something is interesting, that's points. If something is exclusive, that's big points. If something is at the very least not been told elsewhere, that's medium points. So that's what we care about. So in terms of how small companies can get coverage. I mean, I am on the lookout for stories about smaller companies. The reason I was in Kobe today was, well, it's not a small company, but it wasn't Toyota. There's I have an interest, but it has to be, if the readers haven't already heard of the company, then the product or the story or whatever has to be pretty darn interesting. I mean, having a certain amount of market share is cool, but the story has to be quite compelling. But I am on the lookout. Not that I can always get there. Yeah. But, yeah.
Well, maybe you can
give us news.
Give him your
saying.
scoop during dinner.
Yeah.
Oh, I will. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Go ahead. Joan Anderson.
Hi. This is not meant to be a sort of trick question or anything, but I find the way economics is viewed and sort of framed in the media is very limited. Or, I mean, the way things are still measured in terms of GDP, GNP is so crude, and there are now many other sets of indicators that are being used in people, in the development world, looking in a much more nuanced way at what economics means in people's lives. So I'd just be interested in your comments on how you, as a reporter, do you think there's any way of taking a slightly broader or different perspective on these kind of issues?
I mean, we do try, particularly at a more general newspaper, to sort of talk about economics in terms of what it means for people, and not just in terms of numbers or in terms of what it even means for investors. But in terms of things like, for example, measuring an economy in terms of gross national happiness, right, which is that movement that came out of originally from, where was it? Bhutan, right? I mean, I think those are all quite interesting. It's just, vulnerable to their own subjective issues and problems, but certainly interesting. And if anyone, has anyone quantified Japan in terms of GNH? I haven't seen that. If there were a reputable, a serious study that came out that tried to describe the Japanese economy in a different way, but one that was reportable, and not because mostly what you're getting is opinion, I'd be very interested in that. But it's hard. I mean, established measures of the economy mean something because they're established. You can compare them with yesterday and last year. You come up with whole different ways of seeing an economy. It may be interesting in and of itself, but the question is, well, so what does that tell us about the direction it's going? I mean, and that's what we really want to know. And GDP, for example, for all of its flaws, there's a database of comparisons from the past, and it gives you a sense of where things might be going. I mean, I think GDP is actually one of the most messed up measures of the economy, even not just for broad philosophical reasons, but for technical reasons. So it's actually not my favorite economic indicator, even though it's kind of the big one and the one we always do. But that has less to do with kind of, again, philosophical issues than kind of how national accounts really are inadequate in a technical way. But yeah, I don't think economic indicators are going to go away. Plus, you can plan for them, which editors love. It's like, what's happening next week? Oh, industrial output, GDP. I mean, that's never going to go away.
Okay, I'm sure everybody's getting hungry. We can smell the aroma from dinner. Do you want to just do one last question?
Yeah, I'll do one last.
We're supposed to wrap up at 8. One
Sure.
last question is okay?
Sure.
is there anybody else? Both you guys
Anyone
have
who
asked
hasn't asked one?
questions
Anyone who
already.
hasn't asked one yet?
Is there anybody else? Okay, Imad, go ahead. Yes, please. Sorry. You can ask him afterwards during dinner.
Yeah.
Imad Ajami, Iris Media, from Lebanon. During your long stay in Japan, sure, as journalist, you faced some critical position. Did you tell us about one of these?
Criticism of my reporting?
No, facing when you are dealing with some politician, Japanese or companies.
Right. Face to face, I had a very interesting talk not long ago with a former employee of TEPCO, everyone's favorite utility. He was in the PR department during the crisis, and he had a very interesting way of framing it. I said, he has since left TEPCO, so we were having a sort of a bit of a reminisce about the days of craziness, and I said, well, you must have faced, the foreign media was particularly critical of TEPCO. It must have been, it must have been very unpleasant to come to work every day and deal with people like me. And his answer, and it may have been because he was talking to me and he was trying to be nice, but his answer was that he preferred to deal with the foreign media than the Japanese media. Because the way he characterized it was that the foreign media was often very critical in stories, on the page, but when we actually called up TEPCO or went to press conferences and asked questions, we asked pointed questions, critical questions, but it never got ugly with the foreign media, and he was happy. Whereas in contrast, and again, I'm getting this secondhand. I've never been a PR person at a Japanese utility in the middle of a nuclear meltdown, but his view was that the Japanese media was soft on the page, but very angry in person. He said he had endless fights on the phone with Japanese reporters who would yell and scream and tell them how they're not giving them the full story and blah blah blah, and we want this, and it was just really like shouting matches, and it was awful. And then the next day in the paper, it was a fairly soft treatment. So I mean that was his view of it, and my experience has generally been that with sitting with people face to face in interviews. The problem is not that it gets heated and you get in an argument and they yell at you. The problem is quite the opposite, if anything, is that people are a little bit hard to draw out. I mean, I've interviewed Prime Minister Abe, and whatever I may have had to say about him in print, I mean, it was a very civilized thing. He doesn't get angry. His PR people might get angry in the end because you're taking up too much time and you want to squeeze a little more than the half an hour you've been given out of it. But these tend to be the biggest fights about logistics and so on. I mean, I'm trying to remember, a situation where in person it got ugly with a Japanese interviewee, and it tends not to happen. I mean, people sometimes get uncomfortable, you get uncomfortable silences, they change the subject. I mean, it's a fight, but it's a kind of quiet fight. Yeah, I don't know how you felt. Maybe maybe you can tell me some of your if you have different stories when we're eating. But I think that's a fairly typical experience of journalists. I mean, and I've got criticism afterwards, and I know certain people, a lot of journalists get attacked sometimes quite viciously, online by anonymous people. But that's it doesn't tend to be vicious in person.
Not face to face. Okay, yeah. Jonathan, thank you so much. Yeah, we really appreciate you coming this evening.
Yeah, I hope it wasn't a waste of your time.
No, absolutely not.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Yeah.
All right, so please enjoy the dinner. Before you go, I just wanted to tell you for our next month, we're going to have Brian Fowler, Bureau Chief for Bloomberg. Then July, Ken Moritsugu with AP. No seminar in August. Then September, we'll have Jake Schlesinger with the Wall Street Journal. October will be Robin Harding with the Financial Times. And November, the last seminar for the year, we'll have Richard Lloyd Perry, the Asia correspondent for the Times of London. All right, so hope to see you next time. Please enjoy dinner. Thank you.
Thank you. That was okay. That was a presentation.